You're lying awake at 3 in the morning, replaying a conversation that happened 6 hours ago. Your chest feels tight. You can't pinpoint exactly when things changed. But somewhere along the way, the person who made you feel alive started making you feel like you were disappearing. And here's what no one tells you. By the time you notice, you're already 7 stages deep into a psychological pattern that's been studied for decades. A pattern so subtle, so gradual, that your mind doesn't register the danger until your identity has already started to fracture. Toxic relationships don't announce themselves. There's no warning label, no sudden shift from light to dark. What makes them so dangerous isn't the obvious cruelty. It's the invisible architecture underneath. The way they're built, brick by brick, using your own emotions as the foundation. Psychology has mapped this territory. Researchers studying emotional manipulation and behavioral psychology have identified something remarkable. Toxic relationships follow a predictable sequence, a hidden cycle that repeats across cultures, across personalities, across every demographic you can imagine. And the pattern always begins the same way, with something that feels like magic. But before we go there, you need to understand why your subconscious mind is so vulnerable to this specific loop. Because it's not about weakness, it's about how human beings are wired to seek connection, to trust patterns, to build narratives that make sense of chaos. And when someone understands that wiring, they can rewire you without you ever noticing the change. Stage 1. The idealization phase. This is where everything begins, not with red flags, but with green lights, bright, intoxicating green lights. The person you've just met seems to understand you in ways no one else ever has. They mirror your values, your humor, your dreams. Conversations feel effortless. Time disappears when you're together. Psychologically, this is called love bombing, but that term doesn't capture the full mechanism at work. What's actually happening is a form of accelerated intimacy. The other person is gathering information about your emotional needs, your insecurities, the gaps in your life, and they're filling them with surgical precision. If you've been lonely, they're suddenly always available. If you've felt misunderstood, they're the first person who truly sees you. Behavioral psychology tells us that intermittent reinforcement, unpredictable rewards, creates the strongest emotional bonds. But in this stage, the reinforcement isn't intermittent yet. It's constant. You're being conditioned to associate this person with euphoria. Here's the real-life example. Sarah, a 32-year-old designer, met Marcus at a work conference. Within 3 weeks, he'd learned about her difficult relationship with her father, her struggle to feel valued in past relationships, and her dream of living abroad. He told her she was rare, that she deserved more than she'd been given. He texted her every morning with something thoughtful. He made her feel like the center of the universe. And Sarah's brain did exactly what brains do. It released dopamine, oxytocin, and created a neural pathway that linked Marcus to safety and validation. The hidden trap? She didn't notice that Marcus never talked about himself with the same depth, that his stories always had someone else to blame, that beneath the charm, there was a carefully constructed performance. Stage 2. The doubt insertion. Weeks or months pass. The relationship feels solid now. And then, something shifts. It's subtle, a comment that stings more than it should. "I'm surprised you wore that." "You're being too sensitive." "I was just joking. Why are you making this a big deal?" These moments are brief, almost forgettable. You brush them off. Maybe you even apologize for overreacting. This is the stage where cognitive dissonance enters the picture. Your mind is holding 2 conflicting truths. This person makes me feel amazing, and this person just made me feel small. Cognitive psychology shows us that when faced with this kind of contradiction, the human brain doesn't simply accept both. It works to resolve the discomfort. And the easiest resolution? To minimize the negative. To tell yourself you're overthinking it. The manipulation here is so effective because it introduces doubt about your own perception. You start questioning your reactions before you question their behavior. This is where the foundation for emotional manipulation is laid. The toxic partner isn't creating a new narrative yet. They're just destabilizing your confidence in your own judgment. One comment becomes two. Two becomes a pattern you're not quite ready to name. Stage 3. The isolation protocol. Now the relationship demands more time, more attention, more proof of your commitment. But it doesn't feel like a demand. It feels like devotion. I just want to spend more time with you. Your friends don't really get us. Why do you need to talk to your ex-coworker? That seems weird. Slowly, imperceptibly, the circle of your life begins to shrink. Social psychology has documented this for decades. Isolation is the cornerstone of control. When you're cut off from outside perspectives, from people who might notice the changes in you, the toxic partner becomes your primary reference point for reality. Your family thinks you're distant now. Your best friend says you've changed, but when you bring this up, your partner has an explanation. They're jealous, they don't understand real love, they're holding you back. And here's the insidious part. You start to believe it, because isolation doesn't just happen physically, it happens psychologically. The internal voice that used to challenge things, that used to trust your instincts, it gets quieter, replaced by the voice of the person you're trying not to lose. Stage 4. The cycle begins. This is where the pattern crystallizes into a predictable loop. The relationship becomes a cycle of tension, explosion, reconciliation, and calm. Tension builds over days. Small criticisms, passive-aggressive silence, a growing sense that you're walking on eggshells. Then comes the explosion. A fight, harsh words. Maybe something gets thrown. Maybe you're blamed for something you didn't do. And then, the reconciliation. Apologies, tears, promises. I'll never do that again. You bring out the worst in me, but also the best. This is the cycle of abuse that psychologists have mapped in detail. And it works because of one simple truth. The reconciliation phase feels like relief, like coming up for air after being held underwater. Your brain doesn't register, this shouldn't be happening in the first place. It registers, thank God it's over. And that relief becomes its own form of addiction. You start living for the calm. You modify your behavior to avoid the tension. You stop bringing up things that might trigger an explosion. You become hyper-aware of moods, tone, body language. You're no longer living your life. You're managing theirs. Stage 5. Identity erosion. Somewhere in the middle of the cycle, you realize you don't recognize yourself anymore. The hobbies you loved feel distant. The career goals you had seem less important. The confidence you once carried has been replaced by a constant, low-level anxiety. This is identity erosion, and it happens gradually, like water wearing down stone. The psychological mechanism here is profound. When your emotional survival depends on another person's approval, you begin to shape yourself around their expectations. You stop trusting your own desires. You stop defending your own boundaries. Your sense of self becomes negotiable. Researchers studying emotional patterns in manipulative relationships have found that victims often describe feeling like a shell of who I used to be. And the toxic partner reinforces this. They remind you of how much you've changed since meeting them, but frame it as improvement. You used to be so closed off. I've helped you become more open. They take credit for your growth while simultaneously undermining your autonomy. The contradiction doesn't register anymore. You've been conditioned to accept their version of reality. Stage 6. The trap tightens. Now you're in deep. Maybe you've moved in together. Maybe there are financial entanglements. Maybe there's a child. The stakes are higher and the exit feels more complicated. This is when the toxic partner escalates their control. They monitor your phone. They question your every decision. They weaponize your vulnerabilities, the very things you shared in stage 1 when you thought you were building intimacy. This stage is where the subconscious mind enters survival mode. You're not thinking about whether you should leave anymore. You're thinking about how to make it through the day without conflict. Behavioral psychology shows us that when humans are in chronic stress, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational decision-making, becomes less active. The amygdala, the fear center, takes over. You're operating on pure survival instinct. And the most devastating part? You blame yourself. You think if you could just communicate better, be more understanding, try harder, it would get better. This is the ultimate success of the pattern. The toxic partner has trained you to see yourself as the problem. Stage 7, the breaking point. This is the stage most people finally recognize, but only because something undeniable happens. A boundary is crossed that even your fractured self can't rationalize. A betrayal, an escalation of violence. A moment of clarity where you see, really see, the pattern for what it is. Or sometimes, it's not one big moment. It's exhaustion, the lay of pretending, the weight of living in a psychological loop that's slowly erasing you. Some people leave at this stage, some don't. Some cycle back to stage 1, the reconciliation so intense it feels like falling in love again. And the pattern starts over, because that's the nature of cycles. They don't end unless someone breaks them. So what's really happening beneath all 7 stages? Why does this pattern work so effectively on intelligent, self-aware people? The answer lies in the intersection of several psychological forces that most of us don't even know are operating. First, there's trauma bonding. When you experience intense highs and lows with someone, your brain creates a powerful attachment, not in spite of the pain, but because of it. The fear of loss, the relief of reconciliation, the unpredictability. All of it triggers the same neurochemical responses as addiction. You're not weak for staying. Your brain has been hijacked by its own survival mechanisms. Second, there's childhood imprinting. If you grew up in an environment where love was conditional, where you had to earn affection, where emotional safety was inconsistent, your subconscious mind recognizes this pattern as familiar. And the human brain gravitates toward the familiar, even when the familiar is painful. Toxic relationships often feel like home to people who learned early that love requires sacrifice of self. Third, cognitive biases play a massive role. The sunk cost fallacy makes you think, I've invested so much time, I can't leave now. Confirmation bias makes you focus on the good moments and dismiss the bad ones as anomalies. Normalcy bias makes you believe it's not that bad, even when outsiders can clearly see it is. And finally, there's the exploitation of your own empathy. Toxic partners are master psychologists, even if they've never studied psychology. They understand, often intuitively, how to trigger your compassion, your guilt, your desire to help. They frame themselves as victims of circumstance. They blame their behavior on past trauma, on stress, on you. And your empathy becomes the weapon they use to keep you locked in place. Here's the uncomfortable truth. This pattern repeats because it exploits fundamental aspects of human nature. We're wired for connection. We're wired to trust. We're wired to create narratives that make sense of our experiences. And toxic relationships hack all 3 of these drives. From an evolutionary perspective, our ancestors survived by forming strong pair bonds and trusting their tribe. Isolation meant death. Conflict within the group had to be resolved. So our brains developed powerful mechanisms to maintain relationships, even dysfunctional ones, even dangerous ones. Leaving wasn't always an option. Adapting was. In modern society, we still carry those ancient psychological loops. But now they're being activated in contexts our biology never prepared us for. We're bonding with people who aren't actually safe. We're trying to fix relationships that aren't actually fixable. And our subconscious mind doesn't know the difference between this relationship is dangerous and this relationship is just challenging. The pattern repeats because we don't see it as a pattern. We see it as a series of isolated events, a bad day, a misunderstanding, a rough patch. And by the time we step back far enough to see the full cycle, we're already 7 stages deep. So how do you break free? Not through willpower alone, not through confrontation. Breaking this pattern requires recognizing it at the level where it operates, in the subconscious mind, in the automatic responses, in the stories you tell yourself about who you are and what you deserve. First, name the pattern out loud, not in your head, out loud. To yourself, to a trusted friend, to a therapist if you have one. Saying, "I think I'm in a toxic relationship," breaks the silence that these dynamics depend on. Your voice carries power that your thoughts don't. When you speak it, you make it real. Second, document everything. Not to build a case, not to prove anything to anyone, but to create an external record that your mind can't rewrite. Text messages, incidents, how you felt, dates and times. Toxic relationships survive on your willingness to forget, to minimize, to rewrite history into something more palatable. A journal breaks that spell. Third, reconnect with one person from your past, one friend you've drifted from, one family member you've been avoiding. Not to tell them everything immediately, but to rebuild a bridge to the world outside the relationship. Isolation is the lock on the cage. Reconnection is the key. And it doesn't have to be dramatic. A text message, a coffee, a phone call. Small acts of resistance against the shrinking of your world. Fourth, notice the moments when you silence yourself. When you almost say something, then stop. When you want to argue, then swallow it. When you modify your truth to keep the peace. Those moments are where your authentic self is being erased. Start tracking them. Not to judge yourself, but to build awareness. You can't change what you don't see. Fifth, ask yourself this question every single day. If this relationship were happening to someone I love, what would I tell them to do? This is the perspective shift that breaks through self-deception. You have clarity about other people's situations that you can't access about your own. So borrow that clarity. Create distance from your own experience by imagining it's happening to someone else. And here's the hardest truth. You might recognize all of this and still not leave. That's not failure. Breaking a psychological pattern isn't a light switch. It's a process. Sometimes it takes multiple attempts. Sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom. Sometimes it takes years of slowly rebuilding the self that was eroded. But recognition is the first crack in the pattern. And every crack weakens the structure until eventually it can no longer hold you. You're lying awake at 3 in the morning. But this time, it's different. This time, you're not replaying the conversation. You're seeing the pattern. All 7 stages laid out like a map of territory you've been wandering through in the dark. And once you see the map, you can't unsee it. The most dangerous relationships aren't the ones that start violent. They're the ones that start perfect. The ones that make you feel chosen. The ones that slowly, invisibly, teach you to abandon yourself in the name of love. Because that's not love. That's a psychological loop masquerading as intimacy. Human behavior follows patterns. Some of those patterns build us, and some of them break us. The difference isn't always obvious in the moment, but it's always visible in the trajectory. And if you're watching this, if you made it to the end, then part of you already knows. Part of you is ready to see. The pattern doesn't have to be permanent, unless you let it remain invisible.